Greetings, everyone, and welcome to our video, Chemical Enlightenment, Gurdjieff's use of drugs and hormones to develop psychic abilities and the evolution of consciousness. Today, I'd like to talk about Gurdjieff and his background as a healer, a psychologist, a pharmacologist, a hypnotist, and his ultimate goal was to try to heal humanity and try to harmonize us with a higher purpose. One thing that many people on the Fourth Way don't talk about is his experimentations with drug use. So we're going to explore a little bit about Gurdjieff's history as a healer and use of drugs, both on himself and others. Gurdjieff reportedly used hormones as well to stimulate different aspects of his students' spiritual growth. And the combination of drugs and hormones not only could heal, but could stimulate incredible psychic abilities that included the ability to see the future or the ability to read thought. So for those of you just joining this channel, we talk about George Gurdjieff a lot. And let's start off at the beginning and how he acquired a lot of this knowledge. George Gurdjieff was born in 1866. And he was born in a little part of ancient Armenia. And Gurdjieff was someone who was a spiritual master. So Gurdjieff was trained in various mystery schools, and he learned alchemy and cosmology and healing. And one thing that's important to remember about these ancient societies is that they really didn't have a term for recreational drug use. That is a more modern idea. To the ancient, drug use was utilized for healing, and drugs were utilized for spiritual development. And Gurdjieff was trained in both the spiritual and physiological properties of drugs for both healing purposes and to try to stimulate higher states of consciousness. And so Gurdjieff talks about this early in his teaching, but he doesn't try experimenting on the students that we know about in the early days. But later in his career, Gurdjieff starts experimenting with various types of drugs to use on his students, most notably in the time period when he was working with the Women of the Rope, which was a literary society in France that was composed of a number of famous lesbian literary authors. They were called the Women of the Rope, and Gurdjieff utilized various drugs in his experiments with them to try to initiate higher states of consciousness. But this is one thing that is quite known about different ancient mystery schools, that they did have knowledge of different psychedelics and of cannabis or hashish and opium. We found different types of pottery and sacred ritual cups and things like that that have contained traces of these drugs. So they would have an initiation with their adepts who perhaps they would give some type of opium or some type of psychedelic to them. And then they would have this experience of unity, and that would create a wave of emotion that could help unite their mental and emotional centers and help them evolve their state of consciousness. One interesting fact that we know about Gurdjieff is that he was reputed as a healer and hypnotist in Russia, and potentially had connections to the Russian monarchy there in the late 1800s, early 1900s. Because when he leaves Russia due to the communist revolution, Gurdjieff leaves Russia with his student Ouspensky, and the intelligence services have a dossier on him because he has connections to the royal monarchy, and they thought that potentially he could be a spy. So various intelligence agencies kept records on Gurdjieff's activities. And we know this because one of Gurdjieff's other students, J.G. Bennett, was a diplomat in Turkey at the time, and Gurdjieff and Ouspensky went through Turkey on their way to Western Europe. They had to go through Turkey from Russia, And J.G. Bennett was an American diplomat in Turkey at the time, and he was given a dossier by the intelligence agencies on Gurdjieff, was told to try to get closer to him to try to suss out whether or not he was a threat. This makes sense given what we know about the Russian royalty at the time. They were utilizing people like Rasputin. They were trying to use these different healers for various purposes for the royal family. And so it makes sense why they would go to someone like Gurdjieff. So we know Gurdjieff was a hypnotist and a healer, and he had a very deep knowledge of drugs and pharmacology. In 1915, he has a conversation with P.D. Ouspensky where he tells him that there are schools which make use of narcotics in the right way. People in these schools take them for self-study in order to look ahead, to know the possibilities better, to see beforehand, in advance, what can be attained later. The man sees this and is convinced that what he's learned theoretically really exists. Then he works consciously. He knows where he is going. Sometimes this is the easiest way of being convinced of the real existence of those possibilities. So Gurdjieff was very aware of the properties and the effects of mind-altering substances. Raphael Lefort, who wrote The Teachers of Gurdjieff, attempted to trace the sources of Gurdjieff's knowledge, and he claims that Gurdjieff studied in Eastern esoteric schools where he was taught the science of pharmacy and pharmacology. And references to the use and properties of alcohol, cocaine, hashish, and opium appear throughout his book, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. One of Gurdjieff's companions in his book, Meetings with Remarkable Men, character Soloviev, is said to be an authority on what is called Eastern medicine in general and on Tibetan medicine in particular. And he was also the world's greatest specialist in the knowledge of opium and hashish on the psyche and the organism of man. And James Webb, a biographer of Gurdjieff, speculates that this character probably never existed, and this character may have been a oblique reference to Gurdjieff himself. Webb also notes that Gurdjieff was contemptuous of Western medicine and claimed that only 3 drugs from the whole Western pharmacopoeia were useful: opium, castor oil, and an unknown substance made from the extract from a certain tree. Although, as we will see, he used far more than just these 3. Gurdjieff was known to be a liberal user of caffeine, tobacco, and alcohol through his long teaching career. Ouspensky notes in his book, In Search of the Miraculous, that Gurdjieff liked to arrange big dinners, buying a quantity of wine and food, of which, however, he often ate or drank practically nothing. However, following his serious automobile accident in 1924, there seems to have been a dramatic change in his habit. In a conversation with his student Jean Toomer, he revealed some of the reasons for his heavy use of drugs and alcohol in the years following 1924. He then told me that following his motor accident, he had been compelled to produce energy artificially. To this end, during a few of the following years, he had consumed enough drink to kill 10 men. And in addition, he consumed 40 pounds of opium. Jean Toomer asked Gurdjieff, "Did you know in advance what you were doing? Or was it an experiment attended by grave risk?" Gurdjieff replied, "It was necessary to create energy artificially. My condition and my means and aims were such. I knew it, yet it was also an experiment and a risk." Gurdjieff's consumption of spirits clearly played an important role in the dissemination of his teachings. He reportedly could drink a very large amount of alcohol without showing any obvious signs of inebriation. According to A.R. Araj, Gurdjieff, who had an unusual capacity for drink, made a careful distinction between ordinary drinking and conscious drinking, which could free the I to think, feel, and talk and act. According to Gurdjieff, certain drugs are sometimes employed in esoteric schools to separate personality as a method of self-study. He said if personality and essence are for a time separated, the man Two beings, as it were, are formed in him, who speak in different voices, have completely different tastes, aims, and interests. There is evidence that Gurdjieff consciously administered drugs of this nature, possibly hashish, on certain occasions. J.G. Bennett was given access to the private, unpublished memoirs of women were collectively known as the Rope, because Gurdjieff explained the inner world journey that he was taking them on was like a high mountain climb where we must be roped together for safety, where each must think of the others on a rope, all for one and one for all. He carried on for 2 or 3 years of very intensive and extraordinary experiments, making use of the method that brought them into remarkable psychic state. It throws a very vivid light upon Gurdjieff's method as a teacher and upon drugs as a method of developing not only psychic experiences, but also opening the hidden channels of the human psyche. It has been noted that these pupils made progress very fast, and that Gurdjieff gave them a program of inner exercises and injections. J.G. Bennett considered the rapid progress made by members of the Rope was due to Gurdjieff's use of drugs. Sophia Wellbeloved states that Gurdjieff carried out a very extraordinary experiment, making use of methods that brought them into a remarkable psychic state. And the women in this group started to develop certain psychic powers, and Gurdjieff developed them rapidly through several different higher states of consciousness. And J.G. Bennett says that the success of this method was mostly due to drugs and hormones that Gurdjieff gave to the group. Noting while that the content of the injections were not specified, he did take blood and urine samples from the group to check what adjustments needed to be made to their medications. For example, Solano noted very heavy menstruation as one physiological side effect, and some others were weepy and experienced suicidal thoughts. But on other occasions, they were forbidden to have alcohol on account of the injections, which suggests drugs as well. So it's likely, based on these accounts, that he was giving them both drugs and hormones, but we're not exactly sure what those consisted of, because they were probably tailored to each of the women's own special chemical makeup, which Gurdjieff was very well trained in how to do this from his schooling in Eastern esoteric schools. The notes of their meeting with Gurdjieff are clear about the fact that Gurdjieff told them that the injections would aid in their spiritual development. Here's a quote from Solano and Hume, who were two of the women of the Rope. They said, "After a certain age, this effort is very difficult and often impossible. There is an artificial aid by means of physiochemical substance. For example, a substance can be injected which will furnish artificial help for prayer. If the effort and the amount of chemical are not balanced, it becomes a dangerous poison for the organism." So Gurdjieff obviously stressed to them that he was giving them these injections and they need to follow his very precise instructions, or else the injections could be dangerous. So it's clear that they were doing some very risky things, but they were still utilizing Gurdjieff's expertise in hormones and drugs and spirituality to help them go through a very accelerated but also dangerous path to awakening. And Gurdjieff used to teach them that humans were nothing, and only through work on themselves and through deliberate suffering and conscious labor could they self-perfect themselves to escape the death of a dog and die part of God. Gurdjieff presented himself as both a white magician and a black magician, pushing them to break their habits and to fully understand their chief feature and to fight tirelessly against it. So Solano also records Gurdjieff speaking of the magician, with the implication that Gurdjieff is a magician. And according to Gurdjieff, the magician is the highest that a man can approach to God, because only he can be impartial and fulfill obligations to God. In old times, the magician was always made the chief because he had cunning. Other magicians could either do white or black magic, but the magician who had cunning and canning could do both white and black magic and was chief of the initiates. A man with real cunning is a man without quotation marks. Angel can only do one thing. Devil can do all. So, Gurdjieff was clearly a healer, a hypnotist, a psychologist, an alchemist, a magician, a doctor in a sense of pharmacology. He was remarkable in how many different types of knowledge he was proficient in, and he was clearly using all of them to help his students achieve a higher state of consciousness. The rope was only in operation for 2 years between 1936 and 1937, but the program of drugs, hormones, intense readings, group conversations, and personal instruction, and the inner exercises that Gurdjieff prescribed for those women constituted a unique teaching that really helped them develop and flourish much quicker than Gurdjieff's earlier students. Another one of Gurdjieff's unusual methods of teaching was the toast to the idiots ritual. Biographer James Moore provides a detailed description of the ceremony, which was first introduced by Gurdjieff in 1922. Gurdjieff would sit at the head of the table while the person seated to his left, designated the master of ceremonies, was responsible for proposing a series of toasts to successive categories of idiot. Each pupil was required to select their own idiot from among at least 12 types, reflecting progressive gradations of spiritual development. As the toasts were drunk, Gurdjieff closely observed each student as the alcohol rendered their natures opaque to scrutiny. William Patterson, an American student of the work, described the challenges presented to the pupil during the course of the ritual. The toasts were said to rarely go beyond the first 9 idiots and often ended earlier. Still, this is a lot of drinking, especially as Gurdjieff demanded that the Armagnac not be sipped but drunk honestly, that is, in a single draft. No doubt it was difficult to stay present when the body had to absorb a series of alcoholic shocks to the system. It demanded a vigilant attention and discrimination. It was also a quick method of seeing people's mechanicality and their inner animal. So Gurdjieff clearly used drugs and alcohol as part of his curriculum to his students in order to help them wake up. And there's one more thing. Gurdjieff wrote a short article called Narcotics and Hormones, and this was published, I believe, sometime in the 50s after Gurdjieff's death. I'm not sure if it was a transcript of one of his talks or if Gurdjieff wrote it himself. I believe it was most likely a transcript. But it's relatively short, so I'm just going to read it here because it's very interesting and it gives more color to what we've been talking about with drugs and hormones. So he begins, narcotics, creating ecstatic state, such as hashish, do not affect the higher centers, but the lower, temporarily abolishing in them that which prevents them from hearing the voice of the higher centers, and uniting the 3 centers, the formatory, the emotional, and the instinctive, for joint work. But the action of the ordinary narcotic is very unsure and inexact, although at the same time it is possible to prepare special substances which would act in a very exact manner on the centers of the human organism and produce one or another effect at will. These specially prepared narcotics are used in Eastern psychological schools for various experiments. In relation to the use of narcotics, all schools may be divided into 2 classes. In one case, narcotics are used for attaining certain definite results. For instance, experience may show that a certain substance introduced into the organism can give man certain powers and capacities which he ordinarily does not possess. In that case, narcotics may be used for creating these states and for using them for definite purposes. For example, under the influence of certain narcotics, a man may become clairvoyant, may read other people's thoughts, foretell the future, see events which take place at great distances, and so on. Or he may get hypnotic power, enabling him to suggest to other people or to a whole crowd one or another idea, or make them see pictures and images which do not really exist. Naturally, such a temporary increase of man's powers and capacities has nothing to do with growth and evolution. On the contrary, the temporary intensification is followed by a terrible reaction, during which the organism loses all it may have acquired, at times even the very possibility to acquire anything in the future. and sometimes simply died. The effects obtained from the use of narcotic in schools of this kind may be varied and exciting, but they invariably contain a certain dose of uncertainty and risk. It is never possible to foretell exactly what results will be obtained. It is never possible to tell what the consequences of those results will be. As a rule, these are schools possessing only incomplete knowledge, sometimes conducted by men who had come into contact with true esoteric schools, but who had not finished their training there, and who wished to act at their own risk and peril, with no relation whatever to esoteric work. In schools of a different kind, schools directly connected with esoteric schools, narcotics are used solely for experiment. A temporary opening up of higher centers by means of one or another narcotic may sometimes be useful to a man, or it may show him what the future has in store for him. A man looks over the fence, as it were, into his future. In other cases, narcotics are used to show a man his present, that is to say, the form and level of his being. There are more than 50 formulas of complicated substances capable of producing a definite effect on one or another center. The use of these substances may considerably help in the work of self-observation and self-study. But this is possible only under the guidance of a man who has full knowledge of the organization and the functions of the human machine and of all the sides of the action of the narcotic. Independent attempts in this direction almost invariably produce negative results because the man who tries to experiment with narcotics does not know the state of his organism or the effect that one or another narcotic may produce on it. In order to attain definite results in one or another organism, it is sometimes necessary to use very complicated mixtures of narcotics, or else introduce into the organism 2, 3, or 4 complicated substances one after another, in definite doses and at definite intervals of time. All this requires a thorough knowledge of the human machine and cannot give exact results without such knowledge. The use of narcotics to change the state of consciousness and alter the conditions of psychic functions affords a tremendous scope for experimental psychology. Strictly speaking, experimental psychology begins with the moment when the knowledge of using substances to affect human function in one or another direction is reached. All the rest is only observing psychology. The use of narcotics in psychological schools is very ancient. In all popular beliefs, legends, and tales, there are stories about miraculous potions, ointment, and incense, which changed the outer aspect of a man, made him invisible or extremely beautiful, and endowed him with miraculous powers. There are Indian legends about the sacred potion, Soma, which gave miraculous powers. In the Eleusinian mysteries, the epitops before the initiation were given a sacred drink. Ancient historians looked upon this drink as a ritual, a ceremonial, but in fact it had a much deeper meaning. The idea of the philosopher's stone, of the elixir of life, permeating all medieval alchemy, is connected with the same thing, that is to say, with rumors which penetrated to the masses, or to unprepared minds of superstitious people, about the use in schools of potions producing incomprehensible psychic effects. But it goes without saying that it is impossible to produce any stable change of being by means of narcotics or chemical substances. Preparations of this kind can only produce a temporary, quickly vanishing effect. To believe that it is possible to create individuality, consciousness, will in a man by means of chemical preparation is the same as, for instance, to believe that by introducing some substance into his organism, a man may become a painter or a musician or a poet or know a foreign language. Although on the other hand, the use of certain substances for experimental purposes may enable a man for a short time to understand a foreign language unknown to him, but of course only to understand, not to speak it. In this case, a man is, for a short time, brought to such a state that he understands not the words, but the thoughts behind the word. For the thoughts, or the form of thoughts, is the same in all languages. It should be understood that every esoteric school which exists in the midst of ordinary life, for a certain period of time, gives rise to a multitude of talk, rumors, and tales. Many curious people who cannot understand or dare to enter the school themselves make use of all kinds of stray information about it in order to form some idea of the school. Moreover, every school inevitably leaves in its trail a series of people who have not finished learning, who have begun but left through weakness of character and lack of perseverance. Such people serve as a rule as the source of information about schools. Thousands of the most incredible suppositions and tales usually exist about the methods of work, means of investigation, experiments, and so on. Then the people themselves who had been in contact with the school but had left often begin after some time to regret having left it. They feel remorseful and try to invent for themselves some means of continuing the same work at a school. But quite naturally, they have no knowledge of the substance of the work and imitate only its outer form. In all forms of imitation, narcotics always play a very important part. Medieval literature contains very rich material on the subject of preparation of various potions, ointments, and so on. All these substances produced a twofold action. First, by the very method of preparation, they hypnotized a man and kept him in the circle of certain ideas and emotions. Secondly, as they contained definite narcotics, mostly preparations of hemp, poppy, and belladonna. They produced certain hallucinations, reproducing what a man had thought or feared or hoped. A characteristic example is the so-called witch's ointment, which, so it is said, produced definite hallucination. The same for all those who used them. Okay, that was the section on narcotic. Now here is the section on hormones. The work of human centers, the speed of which is so different and which are so easily influenced by extraneous matters introduced into the organism, is controlled and governed in the organism itself under normal conditions of existence, not only by currents passing through the nerves to the brain, but also by certain chemical action inside the organism. The theory of hormones in modern physiology is a fairly close illustration of the state of affairs in our organism. It was thought for a long time that psychic centers communicate with one another with external organs by means of nerve ducts. This is to a certain extent true, but it does not exhaust everything that can be said about the relationship of centers to one another and to the external organs of perception as well as to the periphery of the body in general. The theory of communication through nerves failed to explain the extraordinary speed of communication inside the organism, because transmission by means of nervous ducts everywhere requires a certain time, however short, and a transmission in all directions and a total subjugation of the whole organism to one emotion would require a certain length of time, easily reported and calculated. Observations show, however, that these transmissions and subjugations take place instantaneously, without any possibility of establishing the interval of time between the impact and the result. This is the result of the activity of hormones. Hormones are clouds of fine matter, finer than the gaseous matter known to us, which is given off by various organs of our body. These clouds permeate our whole organism with incredible rapidity, and intermingling are the causes of the state in which the organism finds itself at a given moment. Moreover, they constitute the atmosphere of emanation which envelops a human organism for a certain distance. These emanations, or radiations of the organism, connect it with the fine atmosphere which surrounds it, and which penetrates the atmosphere in which we move and breathe. The radiations of the human body, or rather the network of radiations which form the emanations, is of two kinds. First, the absorption, the sucking into the organism of certain substances from the surrounding atmosphere, and second, the throwing out of certain matters from the organism. If the activity of radiations of the second kind is too intense, the organism usually loses its energy. If the activity of the radiations of the first kind predominate, the organism gets stronger and healthier. Certain forms of nervous diseases and disorders, for instance, contusions, falls, and bruises, when there is no definite traumatic injury, depend upon the violation of the right radiations. A strong shock may break off radiation, but such a breaking off is possible only with a very strong and quick shock. The slow movement taking place around us does not break off radiation, because the vibrations of radiation are so quick that slow movement cannot affect them. As regard people influencing one another, there is a great deal that has remained unknown to Western European science, but experimental investigations in esoteric schools have established the fact that there are people who, by their emanation, have a good or a bad influence on others. There are people who give to others and take from them, and thus, as it were, counterbalance one another. But there are other people who give too much and take nothing in return, and yet others who seem to take energy from other people. One or another state of the emanations of our body determines the state of our health. Right and healthy emanation make a man completely or almost immune from infectious diseases, for many microbes perish in the atmosphere of man's healthy emanations. In the same way, inside the organism, hormones may neutralize any origin of disease, any poison, even one capable of killing a man. Not only do healthy emanations affect microbes, they also act on certain insects, especially on the grubs of certain insects, which perish in the atmosphere of strong and healthy emanations. It is known that in time of war, or generally in the conditions of difficult camp life, parasites which live on the human body do not trouble all men equally. There are people who are literally devoured by those parasites, and side by side with them are others who in exactly the same conditions do not suffer for them at all, or suffer very little. So to summarize what we've learned here today, this is a very nuanced topic, and Gurdjieff clearly wasn't either fully pro drugs and alcohol, nor was he fully against drugs and alcohol. But he had a very precise knowledge through years of learning that taught him how and when to apply these methods for the good of his students. So that's one thing I think that sets Gurdjieff apart from some other gurus that maybe just hand out LSD willy-nilly. Gurdjieff had a more precise method for stimulating these experiences in order to get you over a certain hump in your spiritual development. They didn't take the place of spiritual development. They were to help you get over a certain obstacle or to help you see ahead to something that you could do so that you would work for it. Drugs show you the mountain, but then you have to go climb the mountain. They don't help you get up the mountain, but they can show you that the mountain is there and that you can climb it if you want to. And that's what the purpose of drugs were for, to help his students get over a certain way of thinking so that they could continue their work more quickly. But they definitely weren't a catch-all for all of the problems that anyone could have. It was used very sparingly to attain a very specific result through the knowledge that he had learned. And I just have to say, this is not a endorsement for drugs. Please, if you do drugs, do them responsibly with someone who has knowledge. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. Please have a great day. God bless. Please like and subscribe.